In the last lecture, we took a look at attribution and considered the case of dispositional versus situational attributions for other people's behaviors. In this lesson, what we're going to talk about is when the fundamental attribution error might be most likely to be true, and when it may be the case that people consider situational attributions. So the fundamental attribution error, just to review, is that people tend to draw dispositional attributions by default, that they answer the question of why someone did a behavior with a response having something to do with the person, him or herself, ignoring the factors of a situation that could have been influential as well. But the question is this always the case? Is it always true that people ignore situational factors and just rely upon dispositional explanations? Well, one model that's tried to answer this question and understand when, if ever, people account for the situation in their explanations is Dan Gilbert's correction model. And in this model, what he proposes is that there are 3 stages of attribution. In the first stage, you identify the behavior. In the second stage, you draw a dispositional attribution by default. And then, after you've already committed yourself to a dispositional explanation, you will revise your attribution considering situational factors. And the critical component here is that stages 1 and 2 happen automatically, and stage 3 requires extra time to think. So the idea here is that people will automatically make a dispositional attribution. They'll automatically go, it's something about the person. And only if they have extra ability or motivation to think more about the situation will they revise their answer to reflect situational factors. And one early experiment that demonstrated this 3-stage model is this paper by Gilbert, Pelham, and Kroll in the late 1980s. And what they did is they had participants watch a video of a woman talking with a stranger. This was a video that had no sound. People were just taking a look at a woman who was engaging in conversation, and then they were making judgments about what kind of person this woman is. The thing they manipulated, first off, was the topic of conversation. They either were led to believe that the conversation this woman was having was about sex, which you might expect is an anxiety-provoking topic for a woman to be talking about on camera, or people were led to believe that it was a conversation about travel, a relatively boring topic. So here's the manipulation where they were guiding people to either have a situational explanation for a particular dimension of personality or not. Because eventually they were going to judge how anxious does this woman seem as a personality trait. Then you either can look at her behavior and say, well, she's acting a little anxiously, which you can explain due to a personality, or to the conversation if you have that chance. They also manipulated whether people were cognitively busy. This is just a way of saying, were people distracted? Were they able to think really deeply? Because as we saw, stage 3 of his attribution model requires that people have this open mental freedom to think more about the issue. Whereas if people are busy in their minds and they're constantly thinking about something else, they just don't have the chance to consider the situation. And at the end of the video, everyone was asked to rate how anxious the woman was as a personality trait. Is this woman an anxious person? And to answer that question, you might look at her behavior in the conversation, which she's acting a little anxious in the video. And so if you drew a dispositional attribution, you'd be saying that this is a woman who has a personality trait of anxiety. It's an internal characteristic that caused her anxious behavior in the video. However, if you were able to draw a situational attribution, if you had the chance to do so, if you knew that the situation was anxiety-provoking in that first condition, then you might say that this person isn't an anxious person. It's just something about the situation that made her look that way in the video. So here's what they find. When people aren't able to think very deeply about what's going on, then it didn't matter what topic they told participants the conversation was about. People used a dispositional attribution to say that in either case, what we're dealing with here is an anxious person. As a personality trait, we can explain the anxiety in the video that the woman displays by saying it's something about her. When you don't have time to think more, it doesn't matter that you know the conversation was on one topic or another, you just continue to make that explanation. But when people weren't distracted and they were able to think fully about the situation, then you see a difference in their judgments based on the topic of conversation they thought was happening, such that in the boring topic condition, there really is no situational explanation. The only answer available is still that this woman is an anxious person, and that explains her anxiety in the video. But when you know that the topic is one that would explain why the woman looked anxious in the video, well, then it's not about how anxious this woman is as a person, it's about the situational pressures. And that only is a consideration that people can make when they're fully able to think through what's going on. So the take-home point here is that people can only correct for the situation when they're able to think about it. Another way in which we might see people drawing situational attributions is in what's called the actor-observer effect. In general, we tend to make dispositional attributions for others, as we saw with the fundamental attribution error on average. But we make situational attributions for ourselves. We're more willing to acknowledge situational pressures on our own behaviors. For example, imagine that you know that someone else fails a test, and you're tasked with understanding, well, is this a smart person or is this a dumb person? Or is there something else going on in the situation that would explain that failure? Well, when it's another person like this, you're more likely to go, well, that's just a person who's not very intelligent. This is an internal characteristic that caused the failure. Classic fundamental attribution error. So we make the attribution, they're not very smart, dispositional attribution. But if we turn the tables a little bit, and now you imagine a time in which you yourself have failed a test, well, you're probably not going to draw a dispositional attribution for yourself, and you're more likely to go, well, the test was really hard. There's something else in the situation that made me fail, not my own capability necessarily. Another way in which people might account for the situation is what's called a self-serving attribution. This is similar to what we just saw. When we're looking just at our own behavior, and we're trying to figure out when are we going to make one attribution or another for our own behavior, we tend to make dispositional attributions more for our own successes, and we make situational attributions for our own failures. So imagine, again, that you have failed a test. As we just saw, you'd be likely to say the test is really hard. You use a situational attribution to explain it. However, if you got an A on the test and you did really well, under these cases, now you'll take credit for it. You'll say, I'm so bright, I'm so lovely, here's a dispositional attribution. So we can see here also there's some wiggle room for when people draw one kind of explanation versus another. A classic study that demonstrated this is reflected in this example. If you're a private math tutor and your student gets an A on her next math test, well, the attribution you draw for that outcome is that you're a good tutor. You're going to take credit for a success. But if you're a private math tutor and your student fails her next math test, well, then you're just maybe going to think, well, she doesn't have the ability. You're not going to take credit for the failure. You're going to look for other things to explain that outcome. Other things like the other person's disposition. The reason we do this is because it protects our self-esteem and self-image. We'll talk more about this in the next section of the course. But in general, what we're trying to do is make ourselves feel better. We want to think highly of ourselves, and so we can strategically take credit for things or not in a way that creates a higher sense of self-worth. So in summary, we're generally more able to account for external influences for our own actions than we are for others. And we want to take credit for our own successes and deflect blame for our failures by using situational attributions.